Hello everyone and welcome back to Bear Reads Books. I'm Bear and it's been a while. I was away on holidays. I had this grand plan to do a Fiji video, and I did. I recorded this great Fiji video, but it was windy as all hell. You couldn't hear a thing. I tried cleaning it up, nothing worked. So here I am. I'll have some footage from Fiji. I'm lovely and tanned, I'm relaxed. It's such a great way to read books. Sitting by the ocean, reading whatever you want, and non-fiction really worked well in such a relaxed setting. I think if I had tried to read these non-fiction books throughout November in a work setting, it would have just annoyed me. But here I am, beginning of December. I'm about to do a November wrap-up video. So just going through all of the novellas. I think I'll do both. So novellas and non-fiction for November. So let's try that. Let's start with non-fiction because there was a whole bunch. Let's start with this one. The quarterly essays, A Rightful Place by Noel Pearson. I've spoken about this before. I think I introduced it at the beginning of November. It was really good, really easy to read. 4 stars. A really clear vision for... It's not a vision for Indigenous Australia, it's a vision for Australia on how to address or begin to address the Indigenous problem we have in Australia. Starting with constitutional recognition for Indigenous peoples, which we've been arguing about for years and years and years and never quite got around to doing. Honestly, arguing about for decades. I think it was first floated as an idea in the 80s or 90s. And then we've been talking about it ever since without actually ever doing anything. So it's a very, very clear statement of intent of how we start the process of reconciling our relationship with Aboriginal Australia. Very, very good. If you aren't in an Australian setting and would like to know a little bit about contemporary Indigenous issues, this is a reasonable place to start. It is an academic essay, but the style is not particularly academic. It's easy to read, so by all means pick it up where you can. If you're on Scribd, Scribd has surprisingly all of the quarterly essays forever that you could just grab as an ebook. So do that. If you just wanted to have a quick read. It is honestly, without the notes, if you don't read the notes and you don't read all the other mini essays that are part of the larger publication, you're looking at approximately 70 to 80 pages. Not even that actually. You're looking at maybe 70 pages. So get on it. Very, very good message. A quarterly essay, A Rightful Place by Noel Pearson. So that was a contemporary look at the Indigenous question for white Australia. So the question being asked of white Australia and how to address the Indigenous issue. Next I went to, where is it? Next I took a backward step about, depending on the science you believe, anywhere between 30 and 120,000 years. This is Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. Wasn't on my initial reading list, but after reading the quarterly essay, I knew I had this on my shelf. My wife had read it and said wonderful things about it, so I grabbed it. What it does, as a background, I studied Indigenous history and Indigenous culture and colonial culture, so the settlement of Australia by white people, and that whole era of history. I studied that both at high school and at university. What I was taught about Indigenous culture was a tiny, tiny bit. We were taught that they were a nomadic people, a subsistence people, that moved from place to place to follow the weather and follow the food. Didn't build any permanent structures, didn't really have any of the markers of what you would call a modern civilized society. This book, Dark Emu, turns all of that theory about terra nullius, which gave white people the reasoning to invade this country in the first place. Terra nullius is Latin and it means empty place. So there was an earth that was empty, therefore we're allowed to colonise it and take it for whatever purpose we wish. And the the idea of the noble savage, which is how they described Aboriginal peoples when white settlers first came to this country. It turns all of those theories on its head, and the science is quite clear in that Aboriginal cultures had very rich and diverse language histories, very rich and diverse ways of protecting themselves through housing, and not temporary housing but permanent housing and settlements, ways of harvesting and sowing and harvesting food and grains, and preparing and cooking those, as well as long-term storage of their harvested materials. All of this in permanent or semi-permanent ways. On top of that, they had this system of trade and barter between one tribe and another tribe that had quite distinct boundaries. So within one cultural group, they had their language, they had a boundary, and they had their peoples settling within those boundaries and free to use the land as they saw fit, as long as it didn't disturb the natural place, and it didn't disturb those on the other sides of the boundaries also trying to exist in their lands and with their culture and their language. And the science seems to be, from my perspective, who've studied this in the past, the science seems to be really clear. We got it wrong. We got it horribly wrong. And we got it wrong because we needed a reason to justify taking this land from Indigenous people. So we made up something called terra nullius and the noble savage, and that they were nomadic and therefore they didn't own anything or didn't build anything, or there was no lasting civilization here, so let's just take it. And that was wrong. And the science now justifies that that was wrong. Before, you could in your mind think, morally, you know it's wrong. But now you're thinking the science backs this up. You know, even though it was morally a horrible thing to do, it was disenfranchising and pushing an entire culture to the boundaries and to the margins. Now the science says, well, you had no reason to do it because they had an existing and well-developed and rich culture and civilization, and you never should have pushed them away. It's a fascinating book. Dark Emu, Bruce Pascoe. Get it wherever you can. So I've looked at contemporary Indigenous issues. We've gone 100,000 years backwards and looked at ancient Aboriginal culture and its place in the larger landscape. And then from there, I went back to the modern age and looked at No Friend But the Mountains. Enjoy the birds. I looked at No Friend But the Mountains by Behrouz, Boochani. And I mentioned this last time that he was imprisoned in a detention centre, and refugees coming to Australia at the moment are imprisoned or detained offshore. And we have agreements with Papua New Guinea on an island called Manus Island, where we house our refugees, sometimes for periods of 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 years, without good cause and without advancing their application for asylum, and then denied and sent back home. There is no process to adequately address the reason why these people fled in the first place and why they chose Australia and to protect them. And Behrouz Boochani transcribed this book by WhatsApp message, and I said that in my last video. I got it wrong about the person. I said he had done it or had been texting a man called Peter Gresta. I got that wrong. I'd mixed up two news stories, unfortunately. I do apologise. But he did have a journalist on the outside and a few friends, lawyers and advocates that he was continuously texting, WhatsApping. And all of those WhatsApps became this book. Quite incredible. It is not a linear biography or an autobiography. It's very poetic and very lyrical, and a lot of the prose is absolutely beautiful, and the translator's notes are almost as fascinating as the text itself. The translator's notes has said that Behrouz has drawn on a lot of of his own cultural literature and the texts within that, and so a lot of allegory and a lot of imagery from those ancient Muslim texts, or those ancient Kurdish, sorry, not Muslim texts, ancient Kurdish texts. He is a Kurdish man, and so he's drawn on all this ancient Kurdish stories, and that and then been translated into English. It's truly, truly beautiful. But in and amongst all of the beautiful writing are some truly horrific stories. There is an entire chapter devoted to how prisoners go to the toilet in this detention facility. It's disgusting. It is. I wanted to stop, but I felt that stopping would devalue what this man was trying to tell me. So I kept reading about people going to the toilet. And there's a whole chapter about going to the toilet. There's a whole chapter about him on the boat trying to reach Australia. There's a whole chapter about the riot that culminated in the government of Papua New Guinea saying that offshore detention was illegal and that they needed to get people out. So there was a very protracted riot where people died, and it's so there's a lot of great stuff in here, but it's not in no way a chronological or a linear biography or a linear story. He's taken little snapshots of things about life as a refugee and then strung them together in a very meaningful way. No Friend But the Mountains by Behrouz Boochani, written from Manus Prison. And as an update, Behrouz was engaged for a speaking tour to New Zealand, and usually his speaking tours have been via Skype or via video conference, but he was given a incredibly limited temporary visa to attend a speaking conference in New Zealand. And when he arrived in New Zealand, not unexpectedly, he's claimed asylum in New Zealand, now citing that he doesn't want to come to Australia because Australia have no interest in protecting him, unfortunately. So now it looks like New Zealand are going to take him as a humanitarian refugee. New Zealand do not detain their refugees offshore, so he will be free to live and wander about freely in New Zealand. So I'm so happy. I heard that news just before I left to go to Fiji, and it is just amazing news. It's one of the best things that could have happened to this man, is to be out of Manus Prison, because he is an advocate and a voice for refugees everywhere, and he should be respected for that. That's that one. So next, I took a journey from refugees, and I went to The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace-Wells. So in a contemporary sense, looking at how we're not just destroying the people around us, and refugees and indigenous peoples, not just how we're destroying the people, but how we're destroying the earth. This is why I said I'm glad I was on holidays, because if I had tried to read this when I was in a work mindset, I probably would have found all these books too dark. But I find them uplifting because there's light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. You know, there are people like Noel Pearson writing about solutions for Indigenous Australia. There's Behrouz Boochani writing about solutions for refugees, and Bruce Pascoe trying to twist the history of ancient Aboriginal culture on its head. And David Wallace-Wells, I think, is showing us a light at the end of the tunnel, or is, at the very least, is driving us to action about climate change. Some truly frightening statistics and science in this book, whether you are a denier or an acceptor of climate change. What he writes started with articles in the New York Times. They were some of the largest read articles in the New York Times in all of history. And he's collated those and expanded upon some of those and put them into this book, The Uninhabitable Earth. Some of the science, some of the statistics are truly frightening, really just frightening. That even if we stopped all emissions right now and everyone met their Paris targets, and right now we said everyone's met their Paris targets, we would still have a 2 to 3%, 2 to 3 degree temperature rise, and the catastrophic events because of that rise he outlines in the book. So that's if we meet our Paris Agreement targets. The problem with that is up until now, not a single country is anywhere near meeting their Paris Agreement targets. So if we don't meet our Paris Agreement targets, and in fact last year, 2018, the world for the first time in more than a decade increased their emissions. And it's not the fault of third world or developing nations, it's not the fault of China, it is the fault of the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, who are the biggest emitters. Europe, well, let's not say the United Kingdom, Europe is the poster child of emission reduction. If the United States did what Europe is doing, then that would cause the world to have a 30% reduction in emissions, which is pretty freaking amazing. So if all countries did or followed the example of some of the European nations, emissions would reduce incredibly. It is truly frightening. I haven't finished this one yet, but I'm going to. It is great. The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace-Wells. That's it for non-fiction. Let me just grab my my history of what I've looked at as well, ebooks and audiobooks. That's it for non-fiction. So on top of that, there was a few fiction things that I was able to cover off. Let me see. So from a fiction standpoint, I looked at The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls by Anissa Gray. It was alright. I think it scratched the surface, or tried to scratch the surface, and then didn't do what it promised us it was going to do. It seemed like a really interesting story of women and girls, and some really interesting things happened. So some characters suffered from body image problems, and other characters lives were falling apart due to alcoholism, and then there was all the relationship issues between mother and daughter, or daughter and grandmother, and so it seemed like some really interesting things were happening, and then it didn't. As I said, it just seemed to scratch at the surface and then move along, and it's kind of been compared to An American Marriage, and I thought, it's not a patch on American Marriage. I gave it 3 stars. I didn't give any of my non-fiction stars. I probably should tell you that at the end. But Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls was a meh. And the other one that I mentioned last was The House Without Windows. Was a short story. Was a novella. House Without Windows by, I can't remember. It was the little one about the child running away from home. It was just dreamy and magical. It was so much fun. I'll put links down below so you can see them. The other thing, I've still got one novella still in play. The novella I have in play is Leaving the Atocha Station by Ben Lerner, and I'm only just into it. It's so good. It's just about an American he's on a scholarship in Madrid in Spain. He's meant to be researching poetry in other languages or something, and he's just using in this scholarship this research grant to just get high and drunk and screw women and just generally just do ridiculous things. It's I've never read anything by Ben Lerner before, and I think he's done some interesting things about he's written like a whole dissertation or a whole book about how much he hates poetry, but then he writes in such a poetic and lyrical way you think this could be a poem, but he hates poetry. He says that poetry, his body refuses to absorb poetry. That's one of the lines in the book, that poetry, his body just can't absorb it, or poetry can't be absorbed into his body. It was a very interesting way of describing it. There's a whole bunch of novellas that I did as well. I might have to cover those in another video, I think. But some other fiction I finished in November. Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White. For some reason I set this down in October and didn't finish. I was enjoying it. It wasn't for lack of enjoyment. I really enjoyed it. But for some reason. So on holidays, ripped through it. It was fantastic. Such a great gothic horror tale in a Victorian setting with so many cool characters, just weird people, all trying to deceive each other for different reasons, and you know, people just not telling the truth or not telling the whole story, so you think they're a bad guy and they're a good guy, and you think they're a good guy, they're a bad guy. It's just so much fun. I loved it. I can't, however, say the same for Pink Mountain on Locust Island. I haven't quite finished this. I'm almost to the end. This is an Australian thing by Jamie Marina Lau. It's had some reasonable reviews out there, and I think there's a read-along going on at the moment through Instagram. I'll have to put the link down below. I can't remember whose Instagram it is, but and it sounded really good on the back, and it says, in bursts of fizzing staccato and claustrophobic prose, this modern Australian take on the classic hard-boiled novel will bounce you between pulverised English, elastic Cantonese and the new dialect of a digitised world. Tip over into a subterranean noir of the most electronic generation. And from that standpoint, it is exactly that. It just isn't interesting. That's about all I have to say about that book. I'm going to finish it. Maybe it'll creep its way to 3 stars just for how interesting the writing is. It is that staccato, fizzing, claustrophobic prose. It is really interesting to read. It's just not an interesting story, if that makes sense. So it's frustrating in that way. I'm about half, 2/3 of the way through. Hopefully it starts to bind together a bit more. I just feel like it's going nowhere. So that's it. A holiday and a bunch of books. I said that was maybe going to creep to 3 stars. This was definitely 4 stars. It was awesome. Not quite finished that, but it's going to be right up there. This is like 5 stars in a romp. That was just amazing. Dark Emu, 5 stars. Quarterly Essay, 4 stars. So it was a great month. I really had fun in November. December though, I'm not committing myself to any readathons or anything of anything. I've got a couple of books to finish off. I've got David Wallace-Wells to finish off. I got Pink Mountain on Locust something to finish off. And then I've got 2/3 of Haruki Murakami that's been sitting idle since September. Been a naughty boy. And I don't know why I put it down, because I was busy. That's why I put it down. But I've got to get back to it because I was really enjoying it. So I think December's going to be Murakami. I think I've said that before. And then maybe January's going to be Ducks Newburyport. I don't know. But I've really enjoyed the novella thing, and I've really enjoyed the non-fiction thing. It was such an interesting break from all the fiction I've read. Looking back over the year, and we are getting to that time of the year where we start thinking about the year in review, I have read very little non-fiction, and I've read very little short fiction. So having a month devoted to both of those things was so rewarding that I found some fantastic things. I'm going to go before I lose the light. I will put in some footage of Fiji. I'm sorry I didn't have a video from Fiji. The wind was just amazing. But it was beautiful nonetheless. So I'll have some footage of that to share, and I'll be back with you very soon for something to do about December. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you may be, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.